Welcome to Bilingual History. Bienvenidos a la historia bilingüe. In today's lesson, we are learning about some of the important events leading up to and the beginning of the Civil War, which was from 1861 to 1865. Hoy vamos a aprender unos eventos conduciendo y al principio de la Guerra Civil de los Estados Unidos. The United States in the 1800s. There was a big divide between northern and southern states. Gran división entre los estados del norte y del sur. Specifically, they were divided on the issue of slavery, específicamente dividido sobre el tema de la esclavitud. Southern plantation owners wanted slavery so they would make money from not paying their workers or treating them like human beings. Los propietarios de las plantaciones del sur querían la esclavitud para ganar dinero al no pagar a sus trabajadores o tratarlos como seres humanos. Finally, there was the issue of racism, el racismo. And the reason the southern plantation owners thought that it was okay to treat their workers the way they did was because of racism. La razón que los propietarios de las plantaciones del sur trataron sus trabajadores como esclavos era porque del racismo. Let's go over some vocabulary. The Underground Railroad. Underground means subterráneo. Railroad is ferrocarril. Does that mean that the Underground Railroad was a train under the earth? Esto significa que el Underground Railroad era un tren debajo de la tierra? No. It was a secret system of paths for escaped slaves. Un sistema secreto de caminos para los esclavos escapados. Everything used a code language. Todo usó un idioma de código. Conductors were people who helped slaves escape and led them on the paths, los conductores. There were the stations, houses where escaped slaves could stop and rest, estaciones. And finally, the passengers or baggage, pasajeros or maletas, those were the escaped slaves. So that was the code language that helped slaves escape from a horrible life in the South. Este fue el idioma con código que ayudó los esclavos a escapar de su vida horrible en el sur. The Fugitive Slave Act. This was a law passed in 1850 by Congress, aprobado en 1850 por el Congreso. If slaves escaped and were captured, they must be returned to their owners, even if they were in a free state. Si los esclavos escaparon y fueron capturados, deben ser devueltos a sus dueños, incluso si estaban en un estado libre. The government was responsible for finding, returning, and putting escaped slaves on trial. El gobierno era responsable de encontrar, devolver y juzgar a los esclavos fugitivos. Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and Bleeding Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed people to choose whether or not they wanted slavery in their state. Unfortunately, this led to Bleeding Kansas, violence between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people. La ley Kansas-Nebraska permitía a las personas elegir si querían o no la esclavitud en su estado. Desafortunadamente, esto condujo a Kansas sangrando, violencia entre personas a favor y en contra de la esclavitud. The Dred Scott Decision, 1857. Dred Scott was a slave who sued for his freedom. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court said that all slaves were property. Dred Scott fue un esclavo que demandó por su libertad. Desafortunadamente, la Corte Suprema dijo que todos los esclavos eran propiedad. John Brown. John Brown was an anti-slavery activist who used violence to fight against the evils of slavery. He was most known for his raid on Harper's Ferry in West Virginia to capture weapons and pro-slavery leaders. Un activista contra la esclavitud que usó la violencia para luchar contra los males de la esclavitud. Más conocido por su redada en Harper's Ferry en West Virginia para capturar armas y líderes a favor de la esclavitud. Abraham Lincoln. He was voted president in 1860. Although he won, the country was definitely divided in their votes between North and South. Elegido presidente en 1860. Aunque ganó, el país quedó definitivamente dividido en sus votos entre el norte y el sur. Secede. The Civil War began when the South seceded or separated or withdrew from the United States. La guerra civil comenzó cuando el sur se separó, retiró de los Estados Unidos. Union, the northern part of the United States. Abraham Lincoln was their president. They were against slavery and against secession. La parte norte de los Estados Unidos. Abraham Lincoln fue su presidente. Estaban en contra de la esclavitud y en contra de la secesión. Confederacy, the southern part of the United States. Jefferson Davis was their president. They were for slavery and for secession. La parte sur de los Estados Unidos. Jefferson Davis era su presidente. Estaban a favor de la esclavitud y de la secesión. Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1st, 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln declared that all slaves in the Confederacy, the states in rebellion against the Union, were freed. Abraham Lincoln declaró que todos los esclavos en la Confederación, los estados en rebelión contra la Unión, fueron liberados. it would take a few more years for the war to be over and for all slaves to be freed. Tomaría unos años más para terminar la guerra y para liberar todos los esclavos. Fill in the spaces with the correct words. Completa los espacios con las palabras correctas. The was a secret system of paths for escaped slaves. Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a secret system of paths for escaped slaves. The forced people to capture and return escaped slaves. Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act forced people to capture and return escaped slaves. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed people to vote whether they wanted slavery or not, unfortunately causing a lot of violence called Bleeding Kansas. In the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court decided that slaves were considered property. In the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court decided that slaves were considered property. Was an activist known for using violence to fight against slavery. John Brown. When won the 1860 election, the South decided to secede. That's correct, Abraham Lincoln. When the South decided to, from the United States, the Civil War began. Secede. When the South decided to secede from the United States, the Civil War began. The North was called the, and the South was called the North was called the Union, and the South was called the Confederacy. During the war, on January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the, which freed all slaves in the Confederacy. Emancipation Proclamation. Although this proclamation freed the slaves in the Confederacy, it was not until a few years later, after the war was finished, that all slaves were freed. Aunque esta proclamación dio la libertad a los esclavos en la Confederación en el sur, no fue hasta unos años más que todos esclavos eran liberados. Thanks for watching. Gracias por ver.